United. The rest of the talk I have to give in English because my Turkish is just growing. Yeah, so let's talk about design thinking. Why should we talk about design thinking today in the context of Digital 2.0? Let me quote a mantra from Halil that he often says, technology is value neutral, and whether it turns out to be good, what we do with it, or bad, depends on us. So in that context, obviously, if we have a design process, design thinking, which is human-oriented, it increases the likelihood that good things come out of the digital muscle that mankind has built in the last 30 years. At Atölye Istanbul, we are passionate about design thinking for two reasons. One is that the way we built this company is partially through design thinking, and secondly, what we want to do in it also has to do with design thinking. I will talk in detail more about it later. Just on the high level, we are building a community of 100+ creative people. We provide them space, we are hosting them physically, mentally, in all their needs in order that they can be happy to create things and innovate. So this is us. We are founders of Atölye İstanbul, Engin, Karim, and myself. I will only briefly talk about us. So there are several things we have in common. All three of us spent about 10 years in the US and came all back to Europe, to Istanbul, in different times within the last 12 months. All of us started with either an analytical or engineering background early in our career, and gradually over the last 10 years moved towards design. In my case, the last 7 years I worked at Apple, bringing innovations, external innovations in and realizing them in Apple products. Yeah, so let's start with design thinking. On the highest level, what's design thinking? Design thinking is a toolkit to create something or to solve problems, and at the very center of at the very center of this toolkit is a human-centered orientation, the user, the customer, and an experimental approach. And before we go more into detail of design thinking, it might be useful to put this a little bit into historic context, to actually say why design thinking has become so famous and why it is so relevant in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so. And so what does design thinking really do for mankind? Why was it even invented? And the core of design thinking is that we want to create something or solve problems, and we want to do it not alone, we want to do it collaboratively. And this something of solving something or creating something, that is something that mankind needed to do for the last 500,000 years, right? So it's actually a core discipline of mankind. And if we look at maybe of the last 100 years, what kind of other activities apart from design thinking who try to address this issue, what other attempts exist there? So there is this systems design engineering, where there's at least 500 books about it, which try to address the same thing in the sense that they ask what principles, what guidelines lead to success when designing something, when creating something, or when solving problems. So they look at many, many different examples in the real world and try to find the principles that make sense, that work. And they created something they call the White Bible, this organization in Cozy with over 10,000 members, and that started in the 1960s, and it tried to address the same problem that design thinking tries to address at a high level. The same more recent agile software development, now also used for hardware design, tries to also find principal guidelines for successful problem solving and designing products. So it's useful to put design thinking into this context to see in which way it is so much better than these attempts. So let's look very briefly at a classical product design process. let me make it a little bit oversimplified. You ask the customer what he wants, you design, you build, this entire thing might take 6 months, a year, in the end you're done and you show it to the client, to the customer. In contrast to that, the agile product design process, it includes much more human aspects and experimental aspects because it interacts with the customer in between and builds prototypes in between. So basically, the difference between those two is more interaction with the target group and more experimentation because you build the same product many times instead of just once. So this is already a big step forward, and design thinking has much in common with this, but design thinking goes beyond that. So that's how we have to, I think, mentally position design thinking and why it is so relevant, because it is in many ways better than any prior attempt in the history of mankind to figure out what is the right way, what are the principles to design and to solve problems. And so in which way does design thinking go beyond? It goes beyond in these detailed steps, which are not well defined under agile product design, and we'll get there in a moment. So how does it come about that suddenly about 15 years ago this new process that is so much better comes about? What kind of a source would bring such a process about? And in retrospect, it's obvious. So David Kelly, sorry, who happens to be on the advisory board of our company, he started over 40 years ago with his company IDEO, where he was as a design consultancy, he was solving problem after problem after problem in a very, very broad area of disciplines. And of course, he was ideally positioned to extract the principles that work the best, to give advice to others how to solve problems well and how to create and innovate well. So, in retrospect, it's kind of obvious that the right answer must come out of an environment like this. And so what is the right answer? What is it that he figured out over those over 40 years? The first 20 years, it wasn't clear to him either. It is really something that became clear only after 20 years of being in that field of solving problem after problem. So the process is actually very simple. First, you try to figure out, well, what is the situation that the customer is in, or what is the problem, but really understand the situation, and then try to solve it, and then try to test it, and if necessary, to start again. So let's go more into detail. The first step, which is, in principle, it's the same as for any kind of other problem-solving process, but the difference is that there is a strong emphasis on empathy. To really understand the user, to not try to understand the user out of the office, but to go to the user, to live with him. And the core desire of this step is to not find out what the user wants, what the customer wants, but what he needs that he may not even know about. And in order to get this right, I said already, you follow the customer, you other things that make sure that you get better answers is you have a multidisciplinary team. And then with this multidisciplinary team, you come together and you discuss the observations, and you come to a conclusion, and you set a marching direction for the project. So first you really observe in the most careful way, and then you set a marching direction. This is actually where many projects fail, because they set the wrong marching direction, because they didn't empathize and listen well enough. So this step is crucial, and this step sets up the next two steps, which is, well, when the objective is set, well then how do we get there? So this step tries to answer the question, well, how do we get there? Again, it tries to find as many possible answers as conceivable in this kind of multidisciplinary team. And it tries to pay attention to human traps, to human pitfalls. For example, human beings, they like to agree, or they like to go along with what the manager says. And what this step tries to prevent these kind of human pitfalls. So the very difference of design thinking compared to, let's say, agile product design is that at every step you either include the human aspects of the customer or the human aspects of the team. And only if you consider both human aspects of the team as well as of the customer, then you can come to a much better level than those other processes that we discussed before. And then obviously prototyping is a very useful tool to imagine things. Human beings often overestimate their ability to imagine things. You can really only see, oftentimes get deeper insight when you actually try things out and not just try to imagine it in your mind. So again, this is another pitfall. Human beings overestimate their ability to imagine, and so this is solved by prototyping. So this is the kind of magic that IDEO and David Kelly came up in the last 40 years, step by step. And it's really rather simple. On the other hand, to understand each step very well, at the D School at Stanford as well as at many other schools, it takes a semester or even several semesters of several classes to really internalize this well. So I cannot really deliver this in the short time we have. But let's try to emphasize why this process is so good. So what I was drawing here below is the classical problem-solving cycle of conventional systems design. Very similar. What is the situation? Where do we want to go? What are the options to get there where we want to go? And then in the end, to build and test. So this is called a problem-solving cycle. This has been around since the 60s. And as you can see, this follows very much the same path. So why is it important to talk about this? Because it helps us in two ways. It helps us to remember the design thinking process on the high level, and it also helps us to understand what the difference is. Because here, the human aspect of the customer is not mentioned in the classical problem-solving cycle, as well as here, all the human pitfalls of the team that designs, they're not mentioned. So really the difference is the double human aspect between the old process and the new process. And that would be a very good takeaway message to remember from this talk, I hope. So let's look at a few examples. Design thinking example here, this one on social innovation. As the water distances increase in Africa, this kind of solution, which was meant for shorter distances, of course, and this one as well, it would be nice to have a better solution. And as you can see here, the human process of design thinking has come to this solution, A, by really understanding the people and their needs, and secondly, by in terms of implementation, how to in detail implement it. It is evident that design thinking, prototyping, as well as avoiding human pitfalls in coming to quick solutions can come up with such kind of a solution that people would probably call obvious in retrospect. And that's actually something also to keep in mind. Solutions which are obvious in retrospect are often the very best ones. In physics as well, like Einstein's relativity is also obvious in retrospect. So here we have another example. This is about ergonomics, and this is about the contrast between, on long distance flights, people would like to sleep. On the other hand, the airline cannot make the space bigger for cost reasons. So here is kind of a design thinking solution that was created actually by IDEO, in this case for New Zealand Airlines, and here you can see the improvement for certain cases, not for all cases. It only works if the plane is not full and if there are only 2 people. So another solution that is obvious in retrospect. And Halil was asking me to also give some digital examples. So here we have one from kind of Google and Apple in a way. This was an app which was downloaded 150 million times. It was called Bump. It was bought by Google, so it was a big success in that way as well, but it was barely used. And if you actually check out the app, it's because they didn't follow human principles, they didn't follow in any way design thinking. On the other hand, a very similar idea to bumping is here the Apple solution, which is called tapping. So some people might know here this already existing Apple TV, and you need to put in 3 kind of passwords there, and you don't have a keyboard, and this is like a huge pain, and for the first 3 generations of this product, customers hated it, including my parents. But these passwords and codes are already in this product that most people have who buy this. So the way to start this product is simply take the phone and tap it onto the surface, and it will transfer everything and it will start immediately in a similar way of how here the idea was to exchange address cards. Sorry, I forgot to mention that before. And another trick is to swing it, to take the phone like this, and then all photos that you took on the day will show up immediately on the display. This is not yet implemented, but it might come in the future. Let's look at one last example. In the digital age, to bring certain kind of humanness into the product is much appreciated by the customer, as we said. And this one was very carefully designed in terms of the user interface in that regard, but we don't have time to go into detail. The most pronounced aspect of this example is that the person who stands here, because it is oriented differently to the wall, there is nobody standing behind you, and you feel much more free. You don't feel like, okay, somebody wanting my money and looking at my PIN number. And yeah, so this is just another example that shows how you can make a beautiful improvement for the customer by including human elements into the design process. So let's summarize. What is the value of design thinking? So the obvious ones that we saw in the examples now is a new direction, a product strategy, something that delights the customer, something that oftentimes would be considered an innovation. So this is kind of a big point, and that's the thing that people remember about design thinking. But there is a hidden power of design thinking that people often don't think about, which is to think of a more powerful problem-solving cycle. That, let's say you are in the middle of a meeting, and the topic could be a ridiculously small topic, but you still need to solve it. And that solution can be so much better if you follow a small form of the design thinking cycle. And that is actually what I would say, what at Apple the more powerful part. This is what we do all the time. And I think this is much more important than what design thinking is, like at the surface, famous for. So let me highlight one last thing for this summary on design thinking. One of the key elements is to listen carefully and to not overlook anything, to really diverge before you make a conclusion of where you want to go. And then, after you have set that goal, then to find the solution for the direction that you have defined. And again, for the solution, by a special kind of human-based brainstorming plus prototyping, you should find much more ideas than in the classical process, and then select out of those at least 10 times more options than in the classical style. Then the likelihood that you find a good solution is much increased. So the divergence first, which then requires a convergence, is key both in the first step where you define the direction of the project, and then equally important in the second phase where you try to solve towards the direction that you have set. So this is, I think, the most important to remember about design thinking. In practice, of course, it doesn't look very linear. It looks very chaotic, and it requires a lot of training And that's why we give design thinking workshops to, for example, to Guarantee Bank, to Siemens, and to Migros, to give a few examples, in order to get the word out and improve indirectly processes. We also invite professors from the Stanford D School. In April, he came to give a design thinking workshop all together with Atölye, which was here at Turkcell, which at least the feedback forms said that they loved it. And so let me conclude now with the 5 more slides very quickly. So we talked about products, but I want to just show very, very briefly that the design thinking process can be also used to define an organization, to design an organization. So we tried to design this organization, Atölye Istanbul, through a design thinking process, and let me just show this very briefly in a few slides. So first let me say what actually Atölye Istanbul is. So it's under one roof, a creative community. We would like that they can ideate, experiment, design, and prototype. And if they want to create a business which is actually the perfect match to Ihsan, which is the phase after this, is what Girişim Fabrikası can deliver, which we are not targeting. So this can be considered as an idea incubator. Well, as a next step, we need a business incubator, which will be the next talk, I believe. This is, okay, let me skip this slide. So in order to design a space like this, one could go a very conventional style of just kind of buying property with money to find and like basically have a year-long process without interacting with people, just based on assumption of what you believe, and in the end show it to the people and wait for them. This would be kind of the classical non-design thinking process. And instead, we chose the sequence of steps as described before. The first step is empathy. And there are a lot of people who are creatives, so it's important to listen to their needs. There are people who have built maker spaces, which is somewhat similar. So the empathy step can take many, many months, just listening in a very open-minded way. Then, together with a selected group of people, one can define what is the best marching direction, and as soon as the marching direction is set, one can, for example, think about what kind of space is most suitable for the users, the ideation process. So, I mean, there are literally hundreds of drawings that we cannot show here, and and also the business side, which makes most sense to the customer as well as to the company. And lastly, to actually prototype it in a small form. So this is our current office here with about 10 people. And this is a small form of Atölye. As I mentioned, Atölye should have 100+ people. And so this is the last step. We are prototyping, we are prototyping in terms of the space, we are prototyping in terms of giving workshops. And all of this can be done without having an expensive space, and only as a last step then to go for the space and open it, which we will do in October. We can publicly announce where that will be in about a month from now. So this concludes my thoughts on design thinking. Just to summarize, it's a powerful toolkit for creating something or solving problems collaboratively, and it's based on human-centered ideals. And the important part is not only that it's human-centered onto the customer, but it's also human-centered on the design team to avoid the typical mistakes that design teams easily can do as all humans. Thank you.